Okay, before we begin, I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm going to give a special thank you to Achihud and his friends. Oh, is that him? There he is, Achihud. Joined just in time. Welcome. I just started the recording.
Sorry about that. We had late dinner.
No problem at all. Should
Can we
I?
have the recording of yesterday's where?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'm going to share them in groups.
Okay.
That was my plan. Achihud, should I begin or should I hold off a bit?
Yeah.
I should start, right?
Yeah, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, so here we go. So sometimes you give a shir, sometimes when you give a shir, or maybe I should say sometimes when I give a shir, I'll give a shir about a topic that I know a lot about, and I want to share what I know about it. Sometimes I give a shir about something that I know very little about, and I want to delve into it a little bit more, and giving a shir on that topic kind of requires me to do that, to delve into it. So this is an example of the latter. This is a topic that I really did not know a whole lot about before starting, and but I wanted to have this opportunity to learn about it and to be able to appreciate it better myself. So here we go. Tonight's shir, or today's shir, depending on whether you're in Cincinnati or in Yerushalayim. Today's shir in Cincinnati, tonight's shir in Yerushalayim, is on the topic of Hoshanos. Now, to appreciate Hoshanos, we've got to take a few steps back and recognize everything that is part of Sukkot. If you take a look at Sukkot, Sukkot is one of the is probably the Yom Tov, the Chag, that has the most things going on at the same time. There's really a lot going on at the same time, simultaneously at Sukkot. And some of these things we're very familiar with, very well aware of. Some of them we're not so familiar with, we're not really involved with, because they are primarily relevant when there is a Beis HaMikdash. And today we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So let's break things down a little bit and get a better understanding of that. If you take all the different elements of Sukkot, sorry, someone needs to be muted, I think. There you go. Okay. If you take all the different elements of Sukkot and you break them down, I came up with 5. There's a lot of different ways that you can divide things up, but that was the division that I came up with. And you'll see very quickly that some of them are things that we're very familiar with, and some of them are things that we're not so familiar with. So the 5 that I came up with are Sukkah, the mitzvah of Leishev Basukkah, the Daled Minim, the mitzvah of Netilas Lulav, taking the Daled Minim, the Musafim, the karbonos that we have, primarily the Parei Chag, the bowls that are offered, that was something very unique to Sukkot that we'll discuss. And the rest of the Musafim, the Elim and the Kvasim, etc., that would be, I will call element number 3. So those are the 3 that we're familiar with. The Sukkah and the Arba Minim, very much so. Those are things that we actually do ourselves. And also the Musafim, even though today we're not offering a carbon Musaf, obviously, but it's in our tefillos. So we are coming in contact with it in a real way in our tefillos. And then there are 2 more elements to Chag, which are Arava and which I'll discuss that in a minute in more depth, what Arava means, and Nisuch HaMayim, pouring the water. Second. There you go. Okay. Just making sure everyone's muted. There's Arava, which is actually Netilas Arava. It's a mitzvah of Arava, specifically Arava. And there is also Nisuch HaMayim, pouring the water. So now these last 2, we have very little connection to. the arava, the mitzvah of netilas arava, of taking the arava, and the nisuch hamayim, pouring the water. So I want to focus in on the arava because that's what's going to help us understand what Hoshanos are all about, and then we'll get into a little bit more depth. And the way I'd like to do things today is to divide this year between pshat and drush. To first focus a little bit on the pshat, filling in our basic understanding of what the Hoshanos are about and what the netilas arava mitzvah is, and then to get into the drush element and a little bit more, perhaps, the significance of it. I just want to pause for 1 minute. Achihud, I'm going to make you the host so that I won't be distracted by people as they need to be admitted and need to be muted, okay?
That's fine.
Okay. It is now yours. Okay. So let's talk about the pshat of the arava. So if you look in the Mishnayos, in the fourth parak of Sukkah, you'll discover right away that there's netilas arava and netilas lulav are not so far apart. The Mishnah says, the first Mishnah in the fourth parak, lulav arava shisha v'shiva. The mitzvah of lulav and the mitzvah of arava are done 6 and 7 days. And then getting into the mitzvah of arava, the Mishnah later says the following: mitzvahs arava ketzad. So how do you do this mitzvah of the arava? Malkom haya lamatim Yerushalayim v'nikra mutza or motza. There was a place low down in Yerushalayim called motza. Yordin lisham, they would go down there. Umalaktin misham murbios shel arava. They would collect these big branches of aravos. Uboin, they would bring them back. V'zokvan otzam b'tzidei hamizbeach. They would stand them up around the walls of the mizbeach, of the altar in the Beis Hamikdash. V'rashem kefufin al gabe mizbeach. They would be very, very long. The Gemara says later 11 amos long, which is very long, approximately 20 feet. And they would go all the way up the sides of the mizbeach, and their tops would kind of droop down over the top of the mizbeach. Tiku ve'eriu v'tiku, they would blow the shofar, tekiah trua tekiah, the kol yom kivanas mizbeach pam achas. Each of the days of Sukkot, they would walk around the mizbeach once. Va'omrim, and they would say, this should sound familiar, Ana Hashem Hoshiana, Ana Hashem Hatzlichana. Which is, that's where the Hoshana, the Hoshia comes from. Hoshana is the blend of Hoshia na, to please save us. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ani v'ho Hoshiana. The Rabbi Yehuda says the language of Ani v'ho Hoshiana. V'osa yoman, on that day, Makivan is the Mizbeach Shiva Pa'amim. They would walk around the Mizbeach 7 times, and that is referring to Hoshana Rabbah. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. So let's take this step by step. In the Mishnah, we see that every single day of Sukkot, there was a mitzvah of taking aravos, standing them up around the Mizbeach, and then they would make hakafos around the Mizbeach, and they would recite Ana Hashem Hoshiana or Ani v'ho Hoshiana. So now there are some details about how this was done that the Mishnah does not discuss, which do become relevant to us in terms of how our minhagim have developed and what we do. But the first thing is that obviously what we're doing in Shul is we walk around the bima with the Sefer Torah on the bima. The Sefer Torah on the bima is supposed to represent the Mizbeach, the altar, which is the center of the Beis Hamikdash. And then our circles around the bima are representative of the circling that was done in the Beis Hamikdash around the Mizbeach. Now, a couple of interesting details. There is a machlokas between the Rambam and Rashi about exactly how this was done. The Rambam, which is the way the Shulchan Aruch, with the language the Shulchan Aruch chooses, the Rambam writes that the Kohanim would stand up the aravos around the Mizbeach, and then they would circle with the Arba Minim. Rashi says that first all the Yisraelim would shake the aravos, and then the Kohanim would stand up the arava. Then the Kohanim would circle the mizbeach and erect the aravos around the mizbeach. Which these different opinions about whether they were circling with the aravos or whether they were circling with the arba minim is reason for why on Hoshana Rabbah there are different minhagim about whether to perform the hakafos, the circlings, with the lulav, with the arba minim, or with the Hoshanos, with the aravos, and why there are some that do both, for both. But I don't want to get too in-depth about that. One fascinating detail about all of this that I didn't delve into until this year was who was making these circles. And the question is raised that if it's the Yisraelim, if it's the Israelites, they shouldn't be able to do it because the location of these circles was right around the Mizbeach. That was too far into the Beis HaMikdash for Yisraelim to be allowed to go. Only Kohanim were allowed in that section of the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, Rav Shvira Gaon takes the position that in a Chanami, that is indeed the case, that it was only the Kohanim that would be making these circuits, not the Yisraelim. The Or Zarua says something fascinating, very, very interesting, that the mitzvah of making these circuits was so significant that it allowed for
brain being the crazy thing that it is. You asked me if I could eat all of the cheese. When I got in the
everyone
house,
could
the
unmute
first thing
themselves, please. Thank you. So the Kohanim, the Or Zarua, excuse me, says that this mitzvah was so great that even the Israelim were allowed to circle the Mizbeach. That was a fascinating thing. So that was all done in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, here's another very interesting thing. If you open up a Chumash and you look carefully in all the psukim, there's 3 different places in the Torah where the Moadim come up. And different details are shared in different places. The most detailed description is what we read on Yom Tov, the beginning of Sukkot, which is in Parshas Emor. And there, we're taught about the mitzvah of Sukkah. We're taught about the mitzvah of the Arba Minim. Ulekachtam lachem b'yom harishon kapos, Prietz Hadar kapos Tamar manaf it's avos arvi nochal, all the 4 species. But there's no mention of this whole mitzvah of the arava, of netilas arava, taking the arava, and of circling the mizbeach. It's just simply not there. And indeed, the Gemara in Sukkah says that you won't find it because it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It was something that was passed on through Masorah. It never made it into the Torah Shebiksav. So that's an important thing to be aware of, that there's a whole nother piece to Sukkot that if you just read the Chumash and you leave it at that, you're not going to be aware of it whatsoever. Nisa Chamayim is another example of this. There's an allusion to the Nisa Chamayim. This is the water libations, there was wine poured on the Mizbeach for all the Yom Tovim. That was typical of Karbonos. But something that only happened on Sukkot was Nisa Chamayim, the pouring of the water. And that was a uniquely joyous avoda, which was the centerpiece of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the tremendous celebrations that took place in the Beis HaMikdash were really centered around the Nisa Chamayim. Nisa Chamayim, the water libation, you also will not find in the Torah explicitly. Here, the Gemara in Ta'anis tells us that there's a remez to it in the psukim. If you look at all the different days of Chol HaMoed and all the different days where we read again and again the different the karbanos and how they are adjusted each day, if you pay very, very close attention, the language for the nisachim, which is referring to the nisach hayayin, the language for the nisachim changes by 1 letter. on 3 of those 7 days. One of them has an extra mem, one of them an extra yud, and then one of them an extra mem, which spells mayim, mem yud mem. So that's the remes to mayim, that's an interesting point in of itself. Why these 2 elements, the nisach hamayim, the water libations, and the arava, do not appear in the Torah itself, but are either through halacha mishmisina or through this remes. Okay, so let's continue. Now, this is all happening in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, today we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So, how did what we do today come about? Now, for the record, the lulav also, the arba minim as well, according to the Torah, only the first day there's a mitzvah of arba minim everywhere. The rest of Sukkot, the mitzvah of the arba minim, is only in the Beis HaMikdash. Why do we perform the mitzvah of the arba minim for all 7 days? Zeicher l'mikdash, to make a remembrance of what was done in the Beis HaMikdash. The arava is a similar story, but it developed a little bit later, following the line of history. Chagai, in the time of the Bayis Sheni, of the second Beis HaMikdash, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, those prophets of the second Beis HaMikdash, they were the ones who started it. But they started a minhag of everyone in the entire Jewish people should do a zecher on the 7th day. Now, interestingly enough, this is while the second Beis HaMikdash was still standing and while they were still performing it in the Beis HaMikdash. But they added that it should be done everywhere on the 7th day as a zecher HaMikdash. After the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, later on in Galus, and somewhere in the after the Chasimus HaTalmud, in the post-Gemara era, in the Zman of the Gaonim in Bavel, there was the minhag extended to doing it every single day. And that's why we have what we have today, that every day we make one circle around, holding our arba minim as a zeicher l'mikdash. And then on Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day, we do it 7 days, which is also, as we read in the Mishnah, what was done in the Beis HaMikdash. They circled 7 days on Hoshana Rabbah. Now, a question is asked, if both the lulav and the arava, or what we'll call the Hoshanos, is a zeicher l'mikdash, why then is the lulav a zeicher l'mikdash that was there from the beginning to be done on all 7 days, and the arava was not that way? And the answer that's given is because the lulav has an ikr min Torah. It has a source from the Torah itself, but the arava, where we actually take the arava, that has no ikr from the Torah. So let me just, I'm sorry, there's 2 overlapping things that I didn't separate clearly. There's circling the bima, and then there's taking the arava. Taking the arava, that is a zeicher l'mikdash as well. That is only done on Hoshana Rabbah, even though it was done on all 7 days in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. The reason for that difference is because the lulav has a source in the Torah to be done for everywhere, at least on the first day. So therefore, the zeicher l'mikdash is broader. It's done on all 7 days. Taking the arava, which is done only on Hoshana Rabbah, that has no pasuk in the Torah at all. Therefore, we only do it on 1 day. We only do it on Hoshana Rabbah, which was the climax of that avoda, of that service, with the 7 circuits that was done on Hoshana Rabbah. That's only done there. The circling that we do every single day, that was a minhag that was developed starting with Chagei Malach and Zechariah, and then expanded during the Gaonic era. So that is the pshat of what we're doing and why we're doing it and where it comes from, which I think is just an important thing to appreciate and to be aware of. Now, to get now into a little bit of the drush element of things, I want to share with you a couple of different ideas that come together nicely. Something that's a little bit unusual about the Hoshanos is the emphasis on din. And if you look at the language of what we recite as we make our circles around the bima, there seems to be we're crying out to Hashem to please save us, please protect us, which doesn't seem to line up with other parts of the broader tefillah, of our broader tefillos, certainly not the emphasis on din. There are elements like in Ya'alev Yavo, asking Hashem to remember us and to bring us back. There are elements of in the Musaf of Mipnei Chata'enu, where we ask Hashem to bring us back. But those are really, when we daven about the Karbanos, and when we daven about what was happening in the Beis HaMikdash, which was so central to all of the Chagim, especially Sukkot. So how can we say that without asking Hashem to bring it back? That's really what's happening there. The Hoshanos are really very focused specifically on din. So now, why is that, and what's the relevance of that? So two things I want to share with you, which I think could help shed some light on this. One is that there's a theme in Sukkot of the Pari HaChag, the oxen that were offered on Sukkot, which is very unique. The number of bulls that were offered was much, much more. It started with 13 on the first day, and it works its way down every single day. 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. Finally, on the seventh day of Sukkot, it's 7. And then Shmini Atzeres is down to just 1. Now, which is more typical for a Yom Tov. Now, the Gemara focuses in on this number. If you look at the numbers, 13 going down to 7 over 7 days, if you add it up, what is the total that you arrive at? You arrive at a total of 70. And there's two different Gemaras that seem to contradict each other, but I think that in reality, they complement each other. One of the Gemaras, both of the Gemaras talk about the Umas HaOlam, the nations of the world. That the number 70 of those 70 bulls correlates with the 70 nations of the world. So one Gemara says that if the nations of the world would have known how much benefit they received from that korban, from those 70 bulls, they never would have destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. That's one Gemara. Now that Gemara seems to say that there's some type of positive element that the Umas HaOlam, the nations of the world, get from this sacrifice, from this korban. There's a different Gemara that says that the number descends, it's Nismayit V'holech, and that is to represent the nations of the world being Nismayit V'holech, decreasing. That seems to imply that the Pari HaChag is something, it works against them. It challenges them, the nations of the world. So that we'll leave that as a question, as a hanging question for a moment, that those two things seem to contradict each other, two different messages in the Pari HaChag, those 70 oxen of Sukkot. Now, it's also interesting to note that Sukkot of all the Yom Tovim is the one where the Umas HaOlam seem to be brought in the most. There's obviously the Pari HaChag, those 70 oxen. There's also the mitzvah of Sukkah itself. In the Nevi'im, the mitzvah of Sukkah is the thing that is brought up, that is mentioned in Achiris HaYomim, in the end of days, as when all of the nation will recognize Hashem, and the entire world will recognize Hashem, and the entire world will celebrate Sukkot together. This is something that we read about in the Haftorah on the first day of Sukkot in the Navi Zechariah. It's also interesting to note that the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which talks about the din of the Umas Ha'olam, the din of the nations of the world, will come about through Sukkah. How is that? Because in the end of days, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to execute judgment on the nations of the world, they're going to complain. They're going to say, Ribono Shel Olam, you never gave us a chance. You never gave us any of these beautiful mitzvahs that you gave to the Jewish people. How can you punish us without giving us that equal opportunity? So what does Hashem do? Hashem gives them the mitzvah of Sukkah. And the nations of the world, they all go out to their Sukkah, and then Hashem makes it extremely hot, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says, and then all the nations of the world, all the non-Jews, they leave the Sukkah and they give it a kick. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then Hashem punishes them, and he says, you see, even when you're given the opportunity, you failed, and therefore you have to be punished, and he punishes the nations of the world. It's very interesting to note that specifically Sukkah, that the nations of the world are being punished, that mitzvah is being used. So a thought to piece everything together, one more thing that really stands alone, but it's also very powerful. There is a Yalkut that the Vilna Gaon quotes, the Bir Hagra, when the Shulchan Aruch brings down this minhag of circling the Mizbeach, he quotes a Yalkut in Tehillim, 703, Tafshin Gimel, and the Yalkut writes, Abechol Yom Hayom Mekivan es Mizbeach Pam Achas, es Levim es Ogim, Biyadeim, etc. But also Hayom, that very day, same language as the Mishnah, referring to the seventh day of Sukkot, which is Hoshanos Rabbah, Makivan Sheva Pamim. They would circle 7 times. Amr Rabbi Chia Zecher LiYericho, as a commemoration to Yericho. Then the Yalkut continues. Hatenach b'zman shebeis hamikdash kayim. This is very good in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. B'zman hazeh, what do we do nowadays? Chazan HaKnesses, the Chazan of the Knesses, of the Beis HaKnesses, Omed Kemalach Elukim. Interesting lashon. He stands like an angel of God. The Sefer Torah Bizro'o, holding the Sefer Torah in his hand. Ve'am Makivan Oso, and then the nation circles him. Dugmas Mizbeach. Just like what was done with the Mizbeach, with the altar in the Beis HaMikdash. So what do we see in this Yalkut? The Yalkut mentions Yericho. So what is the story of Yericho? Yericho was the first city that was conquered when the Jewish people invaded Eretz Yisrael. Yehoshua was leading Klal Yisrael, and it was time to enter the land of Eretz Yisrael, and they came to the city of Yericho. Yericho was a very strong city, and not only was it a very strong city, but it was surrounded by a wall. It was fortified, it was protected by a very strong wall. So what were they supposed to do? How were they supposed to penetrate that wall? HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yehoshua, take the Kohanim and the Aron, and they should go ahead of your army, and they should circle the wall of Yericho. And the rest of your army should follow all of them. You should do this for 7 days. On the first 6 days, you circle once. On the 7th day, you should circle 7 times, and you should blow the shofar. After the 7th day, where all of this was completed and they blew the shofar, the walls of Yericho miraculously came crumbling down. That the circuits that were done in the Beis HaMikdash were a zecher to what occurred then. And I think that if we examine this in context of these other elements of Sukkot that we've noted, with the focus on the Umas HaOlam, it's very fascinating in that that's when Klal Yisrael first entered Eretz Yisrael and first overcame the Umas HaOlam, the nations of the world who were occupying Eretz Yisrael at that time, leading to the Beis HaMikdash. And it was a breaking down of a barrier. It was breaking down that barrier that they had standing in our way, meaning preventing the Jewish people from doing what they needed to do, from kind of reaching our full purpose and our full potential, which was achieved through the entering Eretz Yisrael, occupying the land of Israel, which ultimately would lead to the Beis HaMikdash. But that defeat of the barrier of the nations of the world didn't happen on, but it was done through this process, which we mimic specifically at this time of Sukkot and culminating with Hoshana Rabbah, that circling of the Beis HaMikdash, which we do circling the Bima, with the Sefer Torah and the Bima. So piecing things together, one more element I want to add in here, which I think fits beautifully, and it ties a lot of different elements together. Something that I heard over Yom Tiv, a perspective that I did not consider, that I think has a lot of power to it, and that is that there are perhaps two different cycles that overlap. There is the cycle of the Chagim, of the Shalosh Regalim, beginning with Pesach, and then Shavuos, and then Sukkot, and those are the Regalim of Geula, of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, of focusing very much on the Jewish people specifically. Pesach was when we became a nation. Shavuos was when we were given the Torah, and then Sukkot is remembering HaKadosh Baruch Hu protecting us with the Anani HaKavod, with the clouds of glory, as He took us out, and as we made that transition from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael, as we traveled through the Midbar, through the desert. Three different elements, all of which were part and parcel of the creation of the Jewish nation, very much focused on us, the Jewish people. And those are the Shalosh Regalim. Pesach, the creation of the Jewish people, becoming that Am Segula, Hashem's people. Shavuos, receiving the Torah, receiving our identity. And then Sukkot, which is the transition from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael, which is the completion and the fullness of our purpose as a Jewish people and our existence, arriving in our existence in Eretz Yisrael, and specifically through the protection of Hashem's protection, which is the Anani HaKavod. Those are the cycle of the Geula of the Shalosh Regalim. And then we have an entirely different set of holidays, of the Yomim Noraim, the Yemei Hadin, the days of judgment, that begin with Rosh Hashanah, of course, and then they continue with Yom Kippur, and then what I want to suggest is that they continue into Sukkot as well, which is not such a stretch in that Sukkot is a Zman of Din. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says that Bechag nidonim al hamayim, we were judged for the water. So there's an element of din, an element of judgment there as well. And here's a very, very interesting idea that I didn't put together. I didn't connect to these pieces until I heard this idea. I heard this idea from someone who recently moved to Cincinnati, Rabbi Noah Kunin. And he wanted to suggest that if you take a look at the Rosh Hashanah davening, it's very different than Pesach and Shavuot in that there's much more of a focus on the entire world. And to say it more specifically, the non-Jews as well. The entire universe, and the entire world is taken into account. V'yeda kol pa'ul ki ato pa'alo. Everything that was made should know that you made them. V'yoven kol yatsur ki ato yitzarto. Every person that was formed should know that you formed him. And I think that it very much belongs, because the Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem's kingdom, is not unique to the Jewish people. Hashem's kingdom is over the entire universe. We play a very central role, but our goal in that role as the Am Segula is to make Hashem's Malchus clear to the entire world. And therefore, on the Yemei Hadin, the days of judgment, the focus is not only on us as the Jewish people, but it's on the entire world. And I think that the idea of the chasima, the sealing of the din, being completed on Hoshana Rabbah, explains very much why during Sukkot, the nations of the world are included much more than any of the other chagim. Perhaps it's because that's part of the Yomim Noraim process, probably part of the Yomim Noraim continuum. And I think that this could answer what seemed to be contradiction in the Parya Chag, the bulls of Sukkot, and that's because the misma'it v'holich, the decrease in their number, is to represent a decrease of the nations of the world in their opposition to the Jewish people, which culminates on Hoshana Rabbah. What is the day where their power is the weakest, where only 7 bulls are offered? That's the 7th day of Sukkot, which is none other than Hoshana Rabbah. That is also the day that the wall of Yericho was circled 7 times, and that's when the wall of Yericho came crumbling down. That's when the barrier that they create, blocking the Jewish people in their mission, comes crumbling down. And not in that they are totally eliminated, but their opposition is destroyed. The barrier that they create is removed, and then they too recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what I would like to suggest. And that, I think, is the answer to the contradiction. That's why it's really the 70 bulls are to their benefit. And if the nations of the world would know the benefit that they receive from the 70 bulls, they never would have destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, because their role in recognizing Hashem and in part of that bigger picture, which we begin praying for on Rosh Hashanah, it culminates on Sukkot with a highlight of Hoshana Rabbah. And the circling that we're doing is part of that process of the din, of Hashem as Melech, and therefore crying out to Hashem as we do on Rosh Hashanah specifically, which I think that explains the tefillos of the Hoshanos, which seem to be different than the other Shalosh Regalim and other elements of even Sukkot, because they line up with the Yomim Noraim process, and they culminate with Hoshana Rabbah, which is the most intensity, where even now on Hoshana Rabbah the Kittul comes out, just like on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we don the Kittul because it's a time of din. It's in line with this process. And the Arav in particular, I believe that the Arava lines up with the Mayim, which I don't have this a complete understanding of this, but the 2 elements, as we began, the 2 elements that are not explicit in the Torah are the Arava, the taking of the Arava, that avoda of shaking the Arava, and the Nisuch HaMayim, the water libation. Both of those line up with the Chag Nidonim al HaMayim, being judged on the water. They both line up with the Yomim Noraim continuum, which is culminating during Sukkot, as opposed to the cycle of the Chagim as the Yemei HaGeula, very much focused on the Jewish people and not dealing with the non-Jews and not dealing with the universe as a whole at all, focusing on us and our unique role as the Jewish people of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. That there, those mitzvos are explicit in the Torah. Those are written in the Torah. That we find that contrast as well, that divide, which I think is fascinating, and I think that perhaps this can give us a little more meaning as we do the Hoshanos and as we make those circles over the course of Sukkot and specifically on Hoshana Rabbah to appreciate the culmination of the din and perhaps to give a broader focus on defeating the nations of the world, but not in eliminating them, but defeating the opposition, the element of opposition that is created, kind of standing in our way, and ushering in our return to all of the Jewish people returning to Eretz Yisrael and to the Beis HaMikdash with Mashiach, and with all of the world recognizing Hashem Echad, that Hashem is one, which will ultimately happen on Chag HaSukkot. So I hope you found this shir to be meaningful and interesting, and I wish you all a Chag Sameach. And I again want to thank Achihud for making this happen, and for kind of uniting Gulf Manor Synagogue and Machon Meir, Yeshivat Machon Meir, in this a very unique way, and offering facilitating an opportunity for Divrei Torah to be shared between Cincinnati and Yerushalayim, which I think is something really special. Okay, I wish you all a Chag Sameach.